Hi, I'm Ryan, and I'm going to talk a little bit about giving yourself some backbone using Backbone.js. So it starts out like, what is Backbone.js, right? It's a lightweight MVC framework, which provides you with a model, view, controller, and also something else they throw on top called collections, which is just essentially a way for you to like bundle all of your models together so you can interact with them in a much like easier manner. And essentially what it comes down to is it's a way for you to organize your JavaScript, right? Because we all know that JavaScript can get kind of unruly at times, and this gives you a nice structured way to organize it. The important thing to remember that you can get stuck on is it's a slightly different MVC paradigm than you're used to in Rails, in the sense that like in Rails we view like the view as what the user actually sees in the UI, whereas in Backbone you find the view is more what you interact with, what interacts with the UI, so it takes on a much more iPhone-like paradigm in the sense that like if you have a button click and you want to handle that, that's handled by like the view, whereas like in Rails you think that's more of a controller kind of thing. So essentially what it's doing is changing the flow. The traditional Rails app, Rails model, Rails controller, Rails view, very simple. And what Backbone does is it kind of changes that up. You go from Rails model to Rails controller to Backbone model to Backbone controller to Backbone view. So you think that adds a little bit of complexity. You're like, well, why do I really want to do this? For one, it's a lot easier to test your JavaScript. We have a lot of like heavy client-side stuff these days, and part of the problem, like stuff you run into, is kind of hard to isolate into these modular components that you can test easily with unit tests. Backbone gives you this nice organization, nice structure. It's a lot easier to test things. You can just test a model like you test a model in Rails. It also makes your Rails app more of a simple REST API, which I find makes me architect the application a little bit better, because you're thinking more about how people would want to call it, like what kind of JSON data you want to get back, because that's what gets plugged into your Backbone model, which is what your user eventually sees. I think it saves you a little bit of time if you want to expose an API later. Simplifies your AJAX. Even with the Rails helpers, AJAX can still get a little bit bulky. Backbone essentially gives you this nice method called fetch, which will go out and get the models that you're looking for you. And also lets you offload some of your computation to the client. Rendering templates can be kind of an expensive process, and in this case what you can do is essentially just send JSON, which is pretty light, off to the client and then have the client actually render it. So it's like short little code sample. Essentially this is the meat of what hooks everything up for you. We have a collection, which was just essentially the map to the URL documents, and then the controller has an index function, which is just like an index action in a Rails controller, and it's really easy, right? All it does grabs all those documents for you. You can see documents fetch, and then we just have the two callbacks, success and error. On success, you basically just take your collection and pass it off to the view, where that can be rendered. So there's a lot of good resources. Backbone's really well documented. The Document Cloud wrote really good documentation for it originally, and there's also been a couple of really high-profile blog posts about integrating Backbone with Rails in particular, and if you just Google Backbone and Rails, you get a lot of good information on that kind of stuff. So yeah, does anyone have any questions?
So Backbone is one of the JavaScript MVC frameworks coming out. I know there's also JavaScript MVC and a couple others. Yeah. So yeah, exactly. So how would you compare? What was it that made you go with this one?
Lightweight. So one of the things, JavaScript MVC not so much, but like especially like Sprout, Core, and Cappuccino, you get like a really bulky UI layer that sits on top of everything. And like that adds a lot of extra data. So like one of the things I was looking at doing is like creating like mobile web app, and you don't want to like waste time and waste like resources having to send like this huge package every single time. And like Backbone is I think minified, it's like 200K or something, which is like a lot smaller. And basically the only dependency it has is underscore, which is already pretty small. So that's one of the main reasons. It'll kind of be interesting to see, like I know Sprout Core is kind of trying to trim down their core a little bit. So yeah, that's the main reason.